Joining me in another episode in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. In today's episode, we come to our final study in the sermon. In Matthew chapter 7 and verses 28 and 29, the reaction to Jesus' sermon is recorded. So let's talk about that. Let's go ahead and read the text. It says that it came to pass when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. Every sermon has a reaction. Some people react with indifference. Some people will be encouraged. Some people will be moved to obey the gospel. Others might be moved to anger. And then some, they just fall asleep. Be that as it may, there is a clear reaction here to the sermon that Jesus gave on this important occasion. Particularly what is noticed is his authority. Jesus distinguishes himself among the teachers of the time as being different. And what's different about him is his authority. Jesus was not just giving his take or his spin on the law of Moses. Instead, he was commanding people how they were to live so as to gain entrance to God's kingdom. And the people who heard him teach knew it. There was no mistaking it. Now, we're not going to take the time to do it, but you would it would be very helpful for you if you read Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8 is the aftermath of the Sermon on the Mount. And in each of the interactions that Jesus has with people in Matthew chapter 8, they all make requests of him or appeal to him based upon his authority. And Jesus helps them. And we can make the point very clearly that if we would appeal to Jesus based upon his authority, if we would be willing to humbly submit ourselves to his authority, he will transform our lives. And that happens time and again in Matthew chapter 8. The question is, how do we react to Jesus? What do we think of him and his message? Do we view him as someone who possesses authority? Certainly, he does have authority, and that authority was given to him by God following his resurrection and his ascension then into heaven. He remains King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And if we're going to gain entrance into the kingdom, we have to submit to his rule in our lives. And that certainly has become clear in this sermon. But it would be very helpful for us if we would ask ourselves some questions, if we would do some self-evaluation in light of what Jesus has said in this sermon. And answers to these important questions will help us determine whether or not we are responding to Jesus' authority through humble submission. So if we take this sermon on a whole and just go back to the beginning and work our way through it, asking ourselves how we're responding to the various pieces and parts of this sermon. So some questions that we could ask ourselves. First of all, are we finding blessedness? Are we finding peace and contentment in our lives? We're all after that. We all want that in our lives. Are we finding it? Are we experiencing it? We could go to the Beatitudes to find how we can experience contentment in this life. And if we're not experiencing it, perhaps we're not bringing our hearts into harmony with these very important qualities that Jesus begins with in his sermon. Are we exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees? Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5 that unless we exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, we cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And the rest of the chapter is devoted to instructing us how we are to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Of course, that is done through humility and through self-giving love. Giving up self-righteousness is how we exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. Another question we might ask is, are we becoming ministers of mercy to the brokenhearted, or are we pretending to be judges of the world? It's very easy for us to sit in judgment of the world. We might do that in watching the 24-hour news cycle, sitting and just being arbiters and judges of all of the stories that come across our screen. We can become very hard-hearted toward those who are broken in the world. Our mission is to become ministers of mercy, to find those who are in desperate need of Jesus and help them find him, help them lead them to the kingdom. Another question that we need to ask regards how we treat other people. Are we treating other people as we would want to be treated? That is the golden rule of this message in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. Jesus says that that's the foundation of the law and prophets, is concerns our treatment of our fellow man, our treatment of our neighbor. Are we treating others as we would want to be treated, or are we treating them in a different way, in a way that elevates ourselves? Our treatment of others, especially our enemies, as Jesus points out in this sermon, is deeply revealing of our hearts. Another question we would be wise to ask in light of this transformative message of Jesus is, are we sacrificing selfishness, or are we just living life on a broad path? Jesus describes that there's two paths that we can take in life. There is a narrow path and there's a broad path. Different walks of life which lead to very different outcomes, different destinations. One leads to life, the other leads to destruction. One requires sacrifice, the other is very broad. One is lesser traveled than the other. If we want to find a path that leads to life, then we're going to have to sacrifice selfishness. Are we taking the necessary steps in our lives to do that? Another question that we could ask is, are we doing the will of the Father? Now that seems to be a very simple question, but as Jesus reveals in this sermon, there's a day coming in judgment in which a lot of people are going to be surprised, having thought they were doing the will of the Father, when in actuality they had not. They had neglected the will of the Father. There is more to being a citizen of the kingdom than just being civically engaged. We need to be civically engaged, but our civic engagement, the way we treat other people, how we go about our relationships in the world, has to be based upon our efforts to do the will of the Father. Don't be deceived. You and I are not going to be welcomed into the kingdom just because of the good works that we have done. We must, through faith and obedience, submit ourselves to the will of the Father, and that means something. That means something. Are we being doers of the word, or are we just hearers of the word? And there are a lot of people who might be willing to listen to Jesus. They might be willing to come to an understanding of his message. But not everyone's willing to embrace it, to accept it, to live it. Jesus wants to be more than heard. He wants to be obeyed. And lastly, we'd be wise to ask whether or not we are building our lives upon the rock, the preacher of this sermon. Are we building our lives on Jesus, or are we using something else? Are we building on the rock, or are we building on sand? As Jesus warns, there's a storm coming, and the storm's called death. And in that time, it will be revealed what we've been building our lives upon. Well, in conclusion to this study, in conclusion to this series, in conclusion to this sermon, the best sermons are the ones that challenge our conventions and that cause us to question the motivations of our hearts. Jesus' sermon, without a doubt, accomplishes both of these. Question for us is, how will we react to it? Well, I thank you for joining me. If you've been with me since the beginning of this study, I thank you for that, and I hope that our study has been helpful. I hope that your time has been well spent as we all work together to gain entrance to God's kingdom and to help others find their way to it. Thank you, and I look forward to beginning a new series with you in the coming week. Thank you, and have a nice day.